Imagine discovering your entitled neighbor has turned your barn into her personal parking lot again. But this time, one fed-up rancher flips the script with a revenge so epic, she'll regret every tire track. Get ready for a wild ride of justice served country style. I woke up to the sound of my own barn doors slamming in the wind and my blood pressure spiking faster than my morning coffee could settle in my veins. Because right there, through my kitchen window, I saw Karen's shiny silver SUV parked dead center in my barn again, blocking my tractor, my hay bales, and half my sanity with it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was standing on top of the hood in her ridiculous leopard print bathrobe, screaming at a phone on speaker that she had claimed this barn under community parking lot as if she were some kind of pioneer staking out land in the Wild West. My cattle were shivering in the rain because I couldn't close the barn doors. My morning chores were shot and Karen was having what looked like a one-woman HOA power trip audition on my property at 6:30 in the morning. That was the moment I snapped. The moment the hook of this madness dug in deep because I knew right then I wasn't just going to tell her to leave this time. No, this time I was going to make sure Karen never dared to set foot or tire tread inside my barn again. And whatever it took to get there, I was ready to do it. I threw on my boots and stomped outside, the rain soaking through my jacket almost as fast as the anger boiling under my skin. Karen, what in the blue hell do you think you're doing? I shouted and she turned to me with this smug, lazy wave, like I was the trespasser, not her. She shouted back about how my barn had plenty of space and how my tractor could just wait its turn, as though my livelihood could be put on hold for her morning latte run. I told her for the 100th time this month that this was my private property, my barn, my life's work. And she laughed, actually laughed, saying, "Oh, honey, it's just parking. Don't be so dramatic." While she balanced on my hood like a queen on a stolen throne. Every word she threw out made me feel like a guest on my own land. And the neighbors across the fence started peeking over, pretending not to film because Karen's antics were half soap opera, half comedy show by now. But this wasn't funny anymore. She had pushed it too far. I tried reasoning. The last olive branch I'd ever offer her. I said, "Karen, I've told you politely. I've asked you nicely. This is my barn and you've got your own driveway. Enough is enough." She gasped dramatically like I just told her I was canceling Christmas. And replied, "Well, maybe if you weren't hogging space with all this farm junk, there'd be room for civilized people to park." Civilized people. She actually said that while standing in a farmer's barn, she had invaded uninvited. My fists clenched so tight my nails dug crescent in my palms. But I forced myself to walk away before I did something I'd regret. That morning set the tone for what would come. Because for the first time, I stopped thinking of Karen as an annoying neighbor and started thinking of her as a problem that needed a permanent solution. The day went downhill from there. My hay bales were soaked from the storm because her SUV blocked me from rolling the doors shut. My cattle were cold and cranky, mooing like they were staging a protest, and my entire morning schedule was thrown off while Karen strutted away eventually, leaving behind mud tracks and empty coffee cups like a calling card. By the time I cleaned up the mess, hours of work were lost, and the resentment in my gut had hardened into a plan forming somewhere dark in the back of my mind. I went inside, poured myself another coffee, and called my buddy Hank, the only man who could keep me from doing something crazy or egg me on to do it better. Hank listened to me rant for a solid 10 minutes before saying, "Buddy, you've been patient enough to qualify for sainthood. At this point, you need to teach that woman a lesson she won't forget. Something that makes her think twice before even driving down your road." I told him I tried reasoning, tried kindness, even tried pleading, and nothing worked. Hank chuckled and said, "That's because Karen ain't the type to listen to reason. She's the type that only learns the hard way." That evening, just as the sun was setting, I saw Karen drive by again, slowing her SUV near my barn like a vulture circling roadkill. I knew she'd be back because people like Karen don't respect boundaries. They test them until they find the breaking point. As I watched her disappear down the road, I realized something clear as day. I'd been playing defense all this time, trying to stop her from taking what wasn't hers, when what I needed was to make the idea of parking in my barn so miserable, so unforgettable that she'd never dream of trying it again. A quiet, cold determination settled over me, a kind I hadn't felt since my younger years wrangling outlaws at cattle auctions, who thought they could cheat me out of a sale. Later that night, as the rain tapered off and the barn stood silent again, I walked through it, running my hands along the soaked hay, the mud tracks, the dent in the tractor's bumper where she'd clipped it weeks ago. Every mark was a reminder of how many times she'd trespassed, laughed, and walked away without consequence. My farm had always been my sanctuary, my own slice of peace in a noisy world, and Karen had turned it into a free-for-all parking lot, mocking everything I stood for as a rancher and a man trying to live quietly on his land. I promised myself right there under the dim barn light that I'd reclaim my peace. Not just for a day, not just until her next tantrum, but for good. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, hearing phantom slams of barn doors, imagining Karen's smug face behind the wheel of her SUV, feeling the helpless anger of being ignored on my own property. By dawn, a plan had started to take shape in my mind. One that made me chuckle darkly to myself, half wondering if Hank would think I'd finally lost it. It wasn't just about locking her out next time. No, the next time Karen parked in my barn, I wasn't just going to chase her off. I was going to lock those barn doors, take the only key, and disappear into the mountains for as long as it took for her to realize what trespassing really felt like from the other side of the gate. And when I came back, well, let's just say Karen would wish she'd never even heard the word barn. The game had changed, and she didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to lose it badly. The morning after the barn fiasco felt heavier than usual, the sun barely cutting through the clouds as I dragged myself out of bed. My mind replaying every smug word Karen had thrown at me the day before. I could still hear her laughing like she owned the place. Like my land, my barn. My hard work meant nothing compared to her need for free parking. As I sipped my coffee, staring out at the damp barn doors, a knot of frustration twisted deeper in my stomach, making me feel like if I didn't take control soon, I'd lose not just my barn, but the respect of every neighbor watching this circus unfold. I tried to focus on my chores, feeding the cattle, mending the fence where last night's storm had knocked it loose. But every step I took, I could see those tire tracks splattered across my barn floor. Muddy reminders that Karen had won again, and had burned worse than any sun on a summer's day. By noon, I was pacing around the barn like a caged bull, my anger growing legs, ready to charge, because I knew if I didn't act soon, she'd be back. And next time, it wouldn't just be her SUV. It would be her friends, her little entourage, making my barn their personal event hall. My fears weren't just paranoia. By late afternoon, Karen proved me right. I was inside fixing a busted piece of machinery when I heard loud music blasting from down the road, the bass thumping like a warning drum. I stepped out, wiping my hands on my jeans, and there it was, her SUV, this time with another car following, both pulling up my driveway like it was a public highway. My jaw clenched as I watched Karen climb out, tossing her sunglasses onto her head and strutting to the barn doors with the confidence of a queen arriving at her palace. Behind her were two of her friends, loud, obnoxious, carrying what looked like bags of snacks and cases of soda. My stomach dropped as realization hit. They weren't just parking this time. They were turning my barn into their private party zone. I stormed over, my boots kicking up dust, shouting her name before they could cross the threshold. Karen turned, a fake sweet smile plastered on her face, as if she hadn't just walked straight onto my land uninvited for the 5th time this month. "Oh, relax," she said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "We just need a space to hang out for a bit. Your barn's empty half the time anyway." My temper flared, but I tried one last time to handle it without losing my mind. I said firmly, "Karen, you need to leave now. This is not your property, and you can't just barge in whenever you feel like it." She scoffed, gesturing to her friends, saying loudly, "See, this guy thinks he owns the whole neighborhood. You'd think he invented barns the way he guards this one." The girls laughed, egging her on. And for a moment, standing there on my own land, I felt smaller than ever, humiliated in front of strangers who had no business being here. I tried to stop them from entering, standing in the doorway, but Karen just shrugged and said, "You can't stop community events. It's literally illegal." Which was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. Yet, she said it with such confidence, you'd think she had a law degree. Before I could react, she pushed past me, dragging her friends inside, setting up like they owned the place. Music blasting from a portable speaker, leaving chip bags and soda cans on the hay as if my livelihood was just decoration for their fun. My blood boiled as I stood there, fists clenched, torn between dragging them out and avoiding a scene that might end up with the cops siding with her lies again. Instead, I walked away, my chest tight with anger, calling Hank as I stomped back to the house. When I told him what was happening, he let out a long whistle and said, "Buddy, that woman's begging for a lesson she won't forget. Stop being the nice guy. It's time to put the hammer down." I told him I couldn't risk doing something stupid. But he reminded me that letting Karen win again would just make her bolder. "Next time she'll be running a full-blown rodeo in there," he joked. But I knew deep down he wasn't wrong. By the time they left hours later, the barn looked like a tornado had hit it. Trash was everywhere, hay scattered, one of my tools missing, and my tractor had a new scratch down the side that hadn't been there before. I stood there in the mess, heart pounding, a sense of helpless fury creeping in as I realized my patience had done nothing but feed Karen's arrogance. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with every insult, every smirk, every time she'd waved off my protests like I was some nuisance standing between her and her rights. I thought about all the money I'd lose if this kept happening. The repairs I'd already had to make, the time stolen from my own work because I was constantly cleaning up after someone who treated me like a doormat. I remembered my father's old saying, "A man who won't protect what's his doesn't deserve to keep it." And for the first time, I truly understood it. The next morning, still running on fumes and anger, I started making a plan. I went into town to grab heavy-duty chains and padlocks, the kind that couldn't be snipped with bolt cutters unless you were a professional. As I loaded them into my truck, the hardware store owner, a grizzled old rancher named Big Mike, asked what I needed them for. When I told him about Karen's antics, he laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee, saying, "Sounds like the same Karen who used to park in front of my feed store and block deliveries. Only way she learns is a lesson with teeth." I told him I wasn't sure what I'd do yet, but his words stuck with me as I drove home. People like Karen didn't stop when you asked nicely. They stopped when the consequences were bigger than their ego. That afternoon, while reinforcing my barn doors, I kept replaying yesterday's humiliation. I pictured her smug face, her friends laughing, the mess they left behind, and slowly the beginnings of an idea formed. I wasn't just going to stop her from parking here again. I was going to make sure the memory of her last trespass burned so hot in her mind she'd cross the street just to avoid looking at my barn. I started preparing quietly, making adjustments, thinking through every possible move she could make. I knew Karen well enough by now to predict her next step. She'd see my padlocks, maybe throw a fit, maybe call the cops, maybe even bring more people next time to try and intimidate me. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I'd let her play her little game too long. It was time to change the rules entirely. As the sun went down and I tested the strength of the new locks, a strange calm settled over me, replacing the frustration that had been eating at me for days. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was focused, determined, already imagining the day Karen would pull up in that SUV and find herself in a mess of her own making, powerless to wiggle out of it for once. That thought made me smile for the first time in days. A dark, satisfied smile that said the end of her free ride was coming fast. And when it did, it would be a show this whole town would never forget. The following morning dawned crisp and quiet, the kind of morning where you'd normally hear birds singing, and the world felt at peace. But my head was far from calm. Karen had crossed every line I had, and it was no longer just about inconvenience. It was about respect, dignity, and making sure my land didn't become a free-for-all because one entitled neighbor decided rules didn't apply to her. As I stood in my kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee and staring at the barn from the window, I felt a determination in my chest that hadn't been there before, a fire that told me the time for warnings and pleasantries was long gone. I spent the early hours walking the property, looking for every weakness Karen could exploit, every entry point she might use if I locked one door, and she decided to try another. I knew how her mind worked now. Entitlement like hers didn't take no for an answer. It just looked for another way to turn my property into her convenience. I tightened the locks I had installed, secured the gates, and by mid-morning, I felt like my barn was a fortress. But even as I worked, I knew Karen wouldn't give up that easily. She wasn't just going to park somewhere else. No, Karen thrived on the drama, the power trip of walking all over other people. If I had learned anything about her by now, it was that she'd be back and she'd come with new tricks up her sleeve. Sure enough, my instincts proved right. Late that afternoon, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. That now all too familiar sound that made my stomach knot with a mix of anger and grim satisfaction because I'd been waiting for this. I stepped out onto the porch just in time to see Karen's SUV rolling up the driveway, this time with her leaning out the window, already yelling something about community rights before she'd even park. I watched her pull up to the barn, slow down as she noticed the new locks, and then slam her car door harder than necessary as she stormed out, arms flailing in exaggerated outrage. "You can't just lock people out," she screamed across the yard as if I were some villain standing between her and her imaginary parking entitlement. I didn't bother raising my voice, just walked toward her with calm, deliberate steps that made her falter for half a second before regaining her usual false bravado. I told her firmly that this was my land, my barn, and this nonsense was over. But she launched into one of her trademark monologues about how laws are changing and how she had talked to the HOA, and they agreed she could park here. I knew every word was a lie, but that wasn't the point for Karen. The point was to talk loud enough and long enough to make people believe she had the authority to do whatever she wanted. This time though, I wasn't arguing back. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her spin her tail, waiting for her to run out of steam. When she realized I wasn't biting, she changed tactics, trying to appeal to pity, saying her driveway was full because of a delivery that she had no choice, that I was being heartless and unneighborly. I stared at her, remembering every trash bag she'd left in my barn, every mess, every scratch on my equipment, every time she'd mocked me for trying to keep my property in order. And I felt no sympathy left to give. I told her flat out she wasn't parking here ever again. No excuses, no exceptions. Her face twisted into a scowl, and she spat out a threat that I'd regret this, that she had connections who'd make my life hell. Then she climbed back into her SUV, revved the engine and peeled out of my driveway, sending gravel flying like a warning shot. I stood there watching her taillights vanish, my jaw tight, my heart hammering. But instead of fear, there was only certainty. This battle wasn't over. But now I knew exactly how I'd end it. That evening, I drove out to Big Mike's ranch, knowing he was the kind of man who'd seen his fair share of entitled neighbors, and knew a thing or two about making a point that couldn't be ignored. He greeted me with a grin, poured me a cup of coffee, and listened as I laid out everything Karen had done. Every insult, every invasion, every time she'd humiliated me on my own property. By the time I finished, his grin had turned into a scowl that matched mine. "You're being too nice," he said bluntly. "And nice don't work on folks like her. You got to set a trap that makes her think twice before even turning her wheel up your driveway." I asked him what he meant, and that's when he told me the story of how years ago a neighbor kept sneaking onto his land to borrow tools without asking. After months of warnings, Big Mike had set up a harmless but unforgettable lesson, chaining the neighbor's borrowed trailer to a post and leaving it there for a week until the man came crawling back with apologies. We both laughed at the absurdity of it, but as he talked, an idea sparked in my mind, one that was bigger, bolder, and guaranteed to leave Karen stunned. It wasn't enough to block her out. I needed to make her feel what it was like to lose control of her precious car, the same way she'd made me feel powerless on my own property. On the drive home, my plans started to take shape. The next time Karen parked in my barn, and I knew there would be a next time, I wouldn't confront her or ask her to leave. No, this time I'd let her waltz right in. Let her get comfortable, let her think she'd won again. Then I'd lock those barn doors tight, take the only key, and head straight for the mountains where no one could reach me for days. By the time I came back, Karen would have had plenty of time to reflect on her actions while her beloved SUV sat trapped like a trespassing animal in a cage. And just for good measure, I thought about how I'd keep her from ever pulling the same stunt again. Maybe a new fence, one she couldn't talk her way through, something permanent that made sure my barn stayed mine forever. As I pulled into my driveway that night, the barn stood silent in the moonlight. The new locks gleaming on the doors. I felt a strange sense of anticipation, a calm before the storm, knowing the next move Karen made would set everything into motion. I walked through the barn one last time, making mental notes of every place I could reinforce, every angle I needed to watch. I imagined the look on her face when she realized the trap had sprung. The panic, the frustration, the helplessness of knowing she couldn't just bully her way out this time. That image gave me a grim satisfaction I hadn't felt since this mess started. Before turning in for the night, I sat on the porch staring out at the stars, thinking about how far this feud had gone and how absurd it had become. A normal neighbor would have apologized the first time, made amends, respected boundaries, but Karen wasn't normal. She thrived on chaos, fed off other people's frustration, used entitlement as a weapon. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about showing someone who'd made my life a living joke that there were limits, and when you crossed them, there were consequences. Tomorrow, the waiting game would continue. But for the first time, I didn't feel anxious about her next move. I felt ready, patient, like a hunter who knew the prey would wander into the trap eventually. And when she did, this war over my barn would finally turn in my favor. The day Karen finally set herself up for the biggest shock of her life started like any other. Except this time, I was ready, calm, collected, almost too quiet inside because I knew what was coming. The sun was barely up when I saw the familiar glint of her silver SUV turning down my road. The sight of it enough to set my pulse racing, but not with anger this time, with anticipation. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. My expression unreadable, while inside my brain ticked like a clock, counting down to the moment she'd hang herself with her own arrogance. She pulled into the driveway like she owned it. Engine revving, music blaring through her open windows as if to announce to the entire valley that Karen had arrived to claim her parking throne once again. I didn't move, didn't call out, just watched as she marched straight to the barn and opened the doors without even glancing my way, completely convinced there was nothing I could do to stop her. My jaw tightened as her tires crunched over my hay-covered floor, and she swung the SUV inside with practiced entitlement, stepping out in her oversized sunglasses, slamming the door like a statement of victory, muttering something about how this is how it's done, while dusting off her jacket. Little did she know this would be the last time she ever parked here without paying for it dearly. I gave it time, long enough for her to leave the vehicle and strut around as if the barn were her personal garage. Long enough for her to pull out her phone and brag to someone that she had won again. My heart thudded in my chest, not from fear or anger anymore, but from the thrill of finally having the upper hand. When I was sure she was distracted, I strode toward the barn with slow, deliberate steps, my heavy boots echoing in the morning stillness. Karen looked up briefly, smirked, and turned back to her conversation as if I were nothing but background noise on my own land. That was the last straw she would ever pull from my patience. Without a word, I swung the barn doors shut, the creak of the hinges loud enough to make her turn her head sharply. The moment her eyes met mine, I slid the first heavy chain through the latch and snapped the padlock closed with a final metallic clink that echoed like a verdict. She blinked confused for a second, then scoffed and said, "What are you doing? You can't lock me in here," but her voice had a tremor to it now, a threat of disbelief that made my lips curl in a quiet smile. I didn't bother answering. I walked to the other side of the barn, locked the second chain, and then the third. Each one sealing her SUV's fate while she scrambled to the doors, shouting every fake legal threat she could think of, pounding on the wood like a child throwing a tantrum. When the last lock was in place, I finally spoke, my voice calm, measured, the kind of tone that carries more weight than shouting ever could. I told her that trespassing had consequences, that she'd been warned enough times, that today she was finally going to understand what it felt like to be powerless on someone else's land. She screamed back about calling the police, about suing me for false imprisonment, about having me thrown in jail. But her threats bounced off me like raindrops on steel. I tipped my hat, said nothing more, and walked away, leaving her fuming behind locked doors. I could hear her yelling even as I reached my truck, hear her phone ringing as she no doubt tried to drag the sheriff into her mess. But I already knew how that would go. This was my property. Her car was trespassing, and every officer in town was well aware of Karen's antics by now. I climbed into the truck with the single key to those locks in my pocket, turned the engine, and headed straight for the mountains with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The drive up the winding dirt road felt like freedom itself. Every mile putting more distance between me and the chaos Karen had brought to my life. I rolled the windows down, let the crisp mountain air wash over me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed, a deep, satisfied laugh that came from knowing I'd finally taken my power back. I pictured her pacing in the barn, calling every number she had, trying every excuse and threat she could muster, only to realize none of it worked anymore. I imagined the moment when the sheriff, tired of her antics, would remind her she had no case because she had no right to be there in the first place. The mountains greeted me with their usual peace. The cabin, a small sanctuary surrounded by pine trees and silence, far from the madness I'd left behind. I stepped out of the truck, stretched my arms to the sky, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders as I unlocked the cabin door, knowing Karen's reign of parking terror was finally being dismantled, one locked door at a time. Back at the barn, the scene unfolded exactly as I had pictured. While I was chopping firewood and settling in by the cabin fireplace, my phone buzzed with messages and missed calls I ignored. Hank eventually sent me a picture the sheriff had snapped and forwarded, showing Karen screaming at the barn door, phone in hand, wild hair whipping in the wind, face redder than a ripe tomato, while neighbors stood at a distance laughing and recording the spectacle. Apparently, she had called every law enforcement number she could find, only for each officer to tell her the same thing. She was trespassing. The owner was within his rights to lock his own property, and the only illegal act committed was her refusal to stay off my land. Reports said she even tried to bribe a tow truck driver to break the locks, but the man laughed in her face, saying he'd lose his license if he touched private property without a court order. Each attempt she made only dug her hole deeper, and I could almost hear the panic creeping into her voice as reality started sinking in. Meanwhile, I spent my day in blissful solitude, fishing in the nearby stream, chopping wood, letting the fresh mountain air scrub weeks of stress from my mind. Every so often, I thought of Karen pacing in that barn, probably talking herself in circles, concocting new stories about how she was the victim, how she'd sue me for everything I had once she got out. But this time, for once, her words had no reach, no power, no way to ruin my day or disrupt my work. By the time the sun set behind the peaks, I sat on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee, smiling to myself at how tables had turned. This wasn't just payback. It was a taste of her own medicine served cold and hard. And I knew when I returned, this small act of justice would have shaken her entire world. As I prepared to sleep under the clear mountain sky, I thought about the next step, the final touch that would make sure Karen never repeated this stunt. Locking her car inside my barn was only the beginning. When I came back, I would make the lesson permanent, something that would etch itself into her memory every time she looked at my property. My mind wandered to the idea of fencing. Not just any fence, but a boundary so strong, so undeniable that no excuse or made-up law could ever get her past it again. A fence that would seal not just my barn, but my entire driveway, making sure anyone thinking of parking on my land without permission would think twice. The thought filled me with a kind of satisfaction no words could capture. The feeling of finally building peace with my own two hands. Driving back from the mountains, I felt an energy pulsing through me. A mixture of calm satisfaction and burning resolve. Because while locking Karen's car inside my barn was the first real taste of justice I'd had in weeks, it wasn't enough. I wanted this to be the last time anyone, let alone Karen, ever thought they could step foot on my land without my say-so. The mountains had given me the clarity I needed to take my next step. A plan not just to stop her, but to make a statement the whole neighborhood would remember long after her tantrum faded from memory. As my truck rolled down the familiar dirt road toward my ranch, I rehearsed every step of what I was about to do. Every nail, every post, every strand of wire that would turn my property into a fortress Karen couldn't breach, even in her wildest fantasies of entitlement. I pulled into the driveway, the sight of my barn standing there with those heavy locks still intact, making me grin in triumph. Karen's silver SUV sat trapped inside. And though I couldn't see her face, I could imagine her seething rage, pacing around like a caged tiger that finally realized the bars wouldn't budge. That image gave me the fuel I needed to move fast before she found some new way to twist this situation into her favor. I headed straight for Big Mike's place because if there was one man who understood the art of fencing off a property in record time, it was him. Mike greeted me with his usual non-nonsense attitude. And when I told him I needed a strong fence built immediately, his grin stretched ear to ear. So, the plan worked, huh, he said with a chuckle, clearly having heard through the grapevine how Karen had spent the last 2 days throwing fits in front of a locked barn. I told him it was time to finish this to make sure she never had the chance to repeat her stunt. And Mike slapped my back, saying, let's make it a fence she'll never forget. We spent hours at the hardware store, loading the truck with sturdy posts, concrete, heavy-duty wire, gates with locks stronger than anything Karen could dream of cutting through. Every piece of material felt like another brick in the wall of peace I was building for myself. Another nail in the coffin of her self-proclaimed parking right. Back at my property, Mike and I set to work under the midday sun, sweat rolling down our faces as we dug post holes, poured concrete, and began stretching wire tight around the perimeter of my land. Hank showed up not long after, grinning like a kid at Christmas, as he grabbed a hammer and joined in. "Heard Karen's car is still trapped," he said between swings. "Bet she's losing her mind right about now." I couldn't help laughing, the sound bubbling up freely for the first time in days, imagining Karen pacing, calling every number in her phone, desperate to find someone willing to rescue her car, only to keep hitting brick walls. The neighbors, meanwhile, had gathered at a distance, pretending to take walks or trim hedges, while they openly watched the spectacle of my fence rising higher and stronger with every passing hour. The gossip train was running full steam, and I knew by sunset everyone in town would know what Karen had done, and how I was putting an end to it once and for all. By late afternoon, the fence was already taking shape. A gleaming boundary of steel and stubborn willpower encircling not just my barn but every inch of driveway Karen had ever used as her personal parking lot. Each post we set felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity. Every wire pulled taught a reminder that this land was mine and mine alone. Karen finally showed up halfway through the build, stomping down the road like a storm cloud in heels. Her hair wild, her face twisted with fury. She started shouting before she even reached the gate, demanding I unlock her car, threatening lawyers, police, the HOA, anyone she thought might scare me into caving. But this time, I didn't even stop hammering. Hank looked up at her once and said with a grin, "Ma'am, maybe you should go fetch a mirror before yelling about rights on someone else's property," and went back to work. Karen shrieked in frustration, pulling out her phone, snapping pictures, yelling about evidence for her lawsuit. But every word sounded hollow now. Every threat falling flat because for the first time I wasn't engaging, wasn't arguing. I was building, and the sound of hammers and drills drowned her out like an anthem of victory. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in golden orange, we installed the final gate, a towering structure with a lock so solid even the most determined intruder would think twice before touching it. Karen stood on the other side of the temporary barrier we'd set, screaming herself hoarse, her once pristine SUV still trapped inside my barn. I walked over slowly, wiping sweat from my brow, meeting her furious glare with calm finality. I told her that this fence was the last warning she'd ever get, that my property was no longer a playground for her games, that any attempt to trespass again would end in court, where her long list of invasions and damages would bury her case before it even started. She opened her mouth to fire back, but before she could, the sheriff's truck rolled up, dust billowing behind it. The officer stepped out, tipped his hat to me, and looked at Karen with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion. He reminded her yet again that she had no rights here, that I was well within my legal boundaries, and that if she didn't leave immediately, she'd be spending the night in a holding cell for trespassing and harassment. The color drained from Karen's face, and for the first time in this whole mess, I saw something close to defeat flicker in her eyes. She sputtered a few weak protests before finally storming off down the road, shouting that this wasn't over. But her voice cracked, and we all knew it was. By nightfall, the fence was complete, the gate locked tight, my barn secure in a way it hadn't been in years. Big Mike clapped me on the shoulder. Hank raised a beer to toast the victory, and I stood there looking at what we had built, feeling a kind of peace settle over me that I hadn't known since before Karen ever decided my property was her parking lot. The fence wasn't just wood and wire. It was a promise, a declaration that no one would ever take my land for granted again. Inside the barn, Karen's SUV sat like a monument to her arrogance, fenced in on all sides, locked away with no escape route left. Tomorrow I deal with the legal side of removing it permanently. But tonight, I simply enjoyed the sight of justice standing tall in the form of steel and determination. The neighbors who had gathered to watch gave nods of approval, some even clapping quietly, murmuring how Karen had finally met her match. As I leaned on the new gate under the stars, the cool night air washing over me, I felt a long overdue sense of victory, knowing that for once the bully had lost, and the man who just wanted peace on his own land had won. And deep down I knew the final chapter of this saga was still coming. A reckoning in court that would put an end to Karen's reign of entitlement once and for all. The morning sun rose over my ranch, casting long golden beams over the brand new fence that now stood tall and proud. A clear message to anyone who thought my property was theirs to abuse. The barn doors were still chained. Karen's silver SUV sitting trapped inside like a wild animal in a cage of its own making. And for the first time in months, I felt like my land truly belonged to me again. But I knew Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She had been humiliated, fenced out, and locked up in front of the entire neighborhood, and people like her didn't handle losing well. Sure enough, by mid-morning, a certified letter landed in my mailbox full of threats about lawsuits, claims that I had illegally detained her property, and declarations that she'd have my farm if it was the last thing she did. I read it once, then twice, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all before tossing it onto the kitchen table and calling my lawyer. I had a thick folder ready full of photos, videos, dates, witness statements, and repair bills from every time Karen had trespassed, vandalized, and lied about her so-called right. My lawyer didn't even hesitate when I explained what had happened. He simply said, "Let her file. We'll bury her with evidence." For the first time, the thought of facing Karen in court didn't scare me. It thrilled me. This wasn't going to be another shouting match in my driveway or a Facebook war in the HOA group. This was going to be the moment Karen finally faced consequences in a place where her lies couldn't twist the truth anymore. The trial date came faster than I expected, and the morning of the hearing felt surreal. I drove into town wearing my cleanest shirt and hat, Hank in the passenger seat, grinning like this was the main event of the rodeo. "You ready to end this circus?" he asked, and I nodded, feeling the weight of weeks of anger and frustration boiling into one last push for justice. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors curious to see if Karen could spin her magic on a judge the way she tried to on everyone else. When Karen arrived, she made a spectacle of it, stepping out of a rented luxury car in oversized sunglasses, striding toward the courthouse like a movie star heading to a premiere. Not a defendant trying to justify blatant trespassing. She threw me a smug smile, the same one she'd worn every time she walked into my barn like she owned it. But this time, I met her gaze with calm confidence because I knew something she didn't. This wasn't my barn, my driveway, or my fence anymore. This was a court of law, and her facts would finally matter more than her voice. The hearing started with Karen's lawyer spinning a story so outrageous that even the judge raised an eyebrow. He claimed my barn was community property, that Karen had been given verbal permission by local authorities to park there, that I had maliciously imprisoned her vehicle out of spite. Each sentence felt more ridiculous than the last, but Karen sat there nodding along as if this fantasy were gospel truth. My lawyer stayed quiet until it was our turn, then calmly stood and began laying out the evidence piece by piece. Photos of Karen's SUV blocking my tractor in the rain. Videos of her throwing parties in my barn without permission. Receipts for damaged equipment and stolen tools. Copies of complaints I had filed with the HOA and the Sheriff's Department months before the locks ever went on the doors. Witness statements from neighbors who had seen her screaming, littering, and threatening me on my own land. With every new piece of evidence, Karen's smug expression cracked a little more, her cheeks flushing as the narrative she'd built for herself crumbled in front of the judge and everyone watching. The turning point came when my lawyer introduced the final piece of evidence, something even I hadn't known about until a neighbor brought it forward last minute. It turned out Karen had been charging other people to park in my barn on weekends, pocketing cash by renting out my property as if it were her own. Photos showed multiple cars lined up, text messages between Karen and acquaintances arranging parking spots for a fee, all while I had been the one cleaning up the mess afterward. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the judge's face darkening as he flipped through the proof, and Karen's lawyer stammered, trying to change the subject. But there was no talking out of this one. The truth wasn't just out. It was seared into the record for good. Karen had trespassed, lied, profited off my property, and caused me damages beyond what anyone could excuse as a misunderstanding. When the judge finally spoke, his words were as final as the slam of a gavel. He declared Karen guilty of repeated trespassing, property damage, and harassment. She was ordered to pay full compensation for every repair bill I had submitted, fines for illegal activity on my land, and additional damages for months of lost time and stress. To top it off, the judge granted a permanent restraining order forbidding her from coming within 50 feet of my property ever again. Karen shot up from her chair, screaming about injustice, threatening appeals, accusing the whole courtroom of conspiring against her, but the bailiff's stern glare silenced her tantrum faster than any of my words ever had. I sat there calm and steady, feeling years younger, as the weight I'd been carrying finally lifted off my shoulders. For once, the system had done what it was supposed to do, and the entitled neighbor who had made my life miserable was finally paying for every single stunt she had pulled. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping into a new life. Hank slapped me on the back. Neighbors clapped my shoulder and muttered, "Congratulations." And even the sheriff gave me a nod of approval as he passed by, saying, "About time someone put her in her place." Karen, on the other hand, stormed past everyone, face red, muttering threats under her breath. But no one believed them anymore. The crowd that had once watched her drama with amusement now saw her for what she truly was, a bully who had finally lost. I drove home in silence, letting the relief sink in. The landscape around me brighter, freer, as if my ranch itself knew the war was over. Pulling into my driveway, I saw the fence standing tall, my barn secure, Karen's SUV still locked inside, waiting for the paperwork that would make it mine legally if she didn't pay her fines. It was poetic justice, the image of her once prized vehicle now nothing more than collateral for her arrogance. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery reds and golds, I sat on my porch with Hank and Big Mike, the three of us drinking a well-earned beer while the cattle grazed peacefully. We talked about the insanity of it all, laughed at the absurdity of Karen's lies, and toasted to the fact that good fences, solid locks, and a bit of patience could finally win against even the most relentless entitlement. Deep down, I knew there was one last chapter to this saga. One final act that would close this book forever. Karen's car would either be towed away by her once she paid up or legally auctioned off if she didn't. And either way, it would never darken my barn again. The days following the courtroom victory felt like a long exhale after holding my breath for months. The kind of calm that settles over a man when he knows the battle is truly over. Karen had vanished from sight, her once daily appearances in front of my barn replaced by a strange, almost eerie silence. But even in her absence, the symbol of her arrogance still sat locked inside my barn, that silver SUV that had caused me weeks of headaches and sleepless nights. The court had given her 30 days to pay the fines, compensate me for damages, and arrange the removal of her car legally. 30 days came and went, and not a dime appeared in my mailbox. Not a call from her lawyer, not even a message trying to negotiate. It seemed Karen's pride was stronger than her common sense, because she'd rather lose everything than admit she was wrong. The paperwork was simple after that. With my lawyer's help and the judge's signature, the SUV became mine to auction. A piece of property no different from a rusty old tractor. And for the first time, I stood in front of that barn door with the keys in my hand, knowing I'd won not just a fight, but a lesson no one would forget. Word spread fast in a small town. And by the time the auction day arrived, neighbors gathered on my property like it was a fairground event. Folks who had watched Karen's antics for months came to see the grand finale, a chance to witness the end of the saga that had entertained and infuriated the whole community. Big Mike showed up early, leaning on his truck with a grin, already calling dibs on the SUV just to spite Karen. Hank brought a cooler of beers and a lawn chair, settling in like he was front row at a rodeo. Even the sheriff stopped by, not in uniform, but still carrying that look of satisfaction that comes when a nuisance has been handled the right way. When I opened the barn doors and revealed Karen's once prized car sitting there like a forgotten relic, a ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd. The shine it once had was dulled by weeks of dust. The tires a little flat. The symbol of dominance Karen had wielded for so long now nothing more than a trophy of her defeat. The bidding started slow. A few jokes tossed around about whether anyone wanted to buy a cursed vehicle. But soon enough, Big Mike raised his hand and threw out a number that made heads turn. He wasn't buying it because he needed another car. He was buying it because this SUV had become a legend, a story he could retell around campfires and bar counters for years to come. Other folks joined in for the fun of it. But in the end, Mike's bid stood, and when the gavel came down, the SUV was his. The crowd cheered, not just because someone bought a car, but because a chapter of madness had finally closed in a way that felt fair and final. Mike walked up, handed me the money with a grin, and said, "Don't worry. I've got plans for this beauty." We all knew what he meant. And later, true to his word, he had the SUV repainted bright orange with big black letters on the side reading "Private Property." And "No trespassing," a rolling reminder of the battle that had been fought and won on my land. Life on the ranch slowly returned to normal after that. I woke up each morning without dread, without wondering whose car would be parked in my barn, without worrying about more lies, damage, or drama. The cattle grazed peacefully. The barn doors stayed locked only when I wanted them to be, and my days were my own again. The fence stood tall, my line in the sand drawn forever, and not once did Karen or anyone else dare challenge it. The HOA group went quiet on her usual rants, and rumor had it she'd been stripped of her self-appointed leadership role after the court case made her a laughingstock. Eventually, she moved out of the neighborhood altogether, unable to face the humiliation of losing not just her free parking, but her reputation and money along with it. Nobody missed her. Nobody mourned her departure. And if anyone mentioned her name now, it was usually followed by a chuckle and a shake of the head. For me, the whole ordeal became more than just a story about an annoying neighbor. It was a reminder that letting someone trample over your boundaries only makes them bolder, that kindness without limits turns into an open door for abuse, and that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to outstern them until they're forced to face reality. Hank liked to say we'd pulled off the greatest reverse heist the town had ever seen, locking up a trespasser's car instead of stealing it. And every time he told the tale, it got funnier, more dramatic, with neighbors hanging on every word. The legend of Karen's downfall grew bigger than the truth. But I didn't mind because every version ended the same way, with me standing on my porch, watching peace return to my ranch, knowing no one would ever try that nonsense again. One evening, weeks later, I sat on the porch with Hank and Big Mike, watching the sun dip below the horizon as the cows meandered in the field. Mike had parked Karen's old SUV by his fence for everyone to see, a silent warning sign to trespassers everywhere, and it had become something of a local landmark. Folks passing through would slow down to take pictures, laughing at the sight of it, the story spreading far beyond our small town. I leaned back in my chair, beer in hand, listening to the easy banter of friends and the peaceful sounds of ranch life, and I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was happy, truly happy, not just relieved. My land was mine again. My days were my own, and the shadow of Karen's constant intrusions had lifted like a storm cloud finally blown away by the wind. As the stars came out and the night settled over the valley, I thought back on everything that had happened. The early mornings ruined by Karen's SUV blocking my work. The shouting matches, the humiliation, the exhaustion of dealing with someone who refused to respect basic decency. I thought about the moment I locked those barn doors, the drive to the mountains with the key in my pocket, the sweet silence of knowing she was finally trapped by her own actions. And I thought about how far I'd come from the man who once tried to handle things politely, who gave second chances to someone who didn't deserve them, to the man who stood his ground and reclaimed his home. It wasn't just revenge, though it had tasted sweet. It was justice. It was closure. It was a lesson etched in steel fences and courtroom rulings that would last longer than any of Karen's tantrums. When I finally turned in for the night, my last glance out at the quiet fencing barn made me smile. The war was over. The barn was mine again. And somewhere out there, Karen had learned the hard way that no amount of yelling, lying, or threatening could rewrite the simple truth. Respect other people's land or face the consequences. And as I drifted off to sleep, the sound of distant laughter from my friends and the rustling of cattle in the fields reminded me that sometimes, no matter how loud the chaos gets, the good guys win in the end. And when they do, they win big enough that everyone remembers not to mess with them ever again.